Hello friends, myself Professor Amol Shishrav from Department of Computer Science, CMCS Yodhama. In the previous few sessions, we have seen some of the basic key terms as far as the database management system is concerned. Within that, we have seen the meaning of data, information, database management system. Then after we have just seen some of the roles and responsibilities of the person, that is DBA. And in the last session, we have seen some of the advantages and disadvantages of database management system. Dear friends, in today's session, we will see the data modeling for databases. So, in general, we can say that every organization definitely maintains the data relative to their daily operations, relative to their daily working. And whenever any organization is interested in designing and developing a database for their operational work, at that time the organization has to model the real world objects that can be molded into the database. Okay, so in general we can again say that the organization always interested in identifying such types of objects of interest so that the data respective to them can be stored in the database, and depending on the stored data the organization can access it, organization can manipulate it. So it is important to note down that the organization has to model these objects into the database, and for that sense every organization has to do basic things. Likewise, they should have to identify the object of interest. Then after, they should have to just identify their characteristics or the properties, in general the attributes of those objects. Then after, the organization has to track the relationship amongst them, and then after they have to impose certain constraints or the conditions so that the data can be restricted from the illegal or unauthorized user. And in general, all these things can be called as data modeling for the databases. So we can say that three important activities has to be modeled while designing and developing the database. First one is you should have to identify the object of interest, that is the entities. Then after, you should have to identify their characteristics or properties, that is the attributes. And finally, you should have to track the association or the mapping, that is the relationship that can exist among one or more entities. So we will see what is the meaning of this entity, attributes, relationships and the constants. So let's start our discussion. So our key terms are, first one is the data modeling for the databases. Within that, we'll describe entities along with their attributes. Then after, we'll see what is the meaning of this entity type and entity sets. Then after, we'll discuss the attribute values and the domains. And finally, we'll conclude our discussion with the relationship and the term records and files. So friends, just start our discussion, that is data modeling for the databases. Now, the database is used basically to store the information that is useful to an organization. All of us quite familiar with this fact, because in the previous session we have discussed about that the data plays a vital role for the organizational activities, and that's why we are saying that the database is used to store the information that is useful to an organization. Again, whenever we are trying to store such types of data or the information in our database, basically this data or the information represented in terms of information, and for that sense some modeling means are used. Again, the components used in modeling are limited to the objects of interest, again to the organization and the relationship that can exist among these objects. Basically, there are the objects of variety of categories, and we are saying that the object contains the category. Again, each category of these objects has certain characteristics or the properties, and these are called as generally the attributes. Okay, now, so we'll focus our discussion on the entities and their attributes. So question arises, what is the meaning of this entity? In simple language, an entity is the object in the real world for which an organization can store the data in their database. Again, I am repeating the same thing. Entities are the object of interest to the organization for which the data can be stored in the databases. So we can say that entities are the basic units used in modeling the classes of the interest to the organization. And the collection of basic objects are called as entities. Again, each entity is distinguishable from each other. Some of the examples of the entities are room, chair, then after transaction, and so on. Again, we can say that any object in the real world can be again termed as an entity. Again, being a human, we are also termed as entity because we can store the data for the humans in the human database as well, related to our height, related to our size, related to our vision, related to our color, so on. And if we are maintaining such kind of data or the information in the database, again we can say that a human can be an example of entity. Now we are the students and conversely I am the teacher. So again, each of us do have certain characteristics or the properties, and that's why we are again called as the entity. For the student, we can have the roll number of the student, again the name of the student, and for all these things, we can maintain the data in the student database. That's why the student can also be called as an entity. So, I do think you are quite familiar with the fact about the entity. Again, these entities are the objects in the real world for which we can store the data in the databases. Now, question arises, what is entity type or entity set? Now, in simple language, entity set is the collection of similar kinds or types of entities. Again, I am repeating the same thing. Entity set is the collection of similar types or kinds of entities. And that's why an entity type or entity set is the group of similar objects which have some properties amongst them. Means they are having certain properties which can just distinguish them with one another. For example, transactions, then after the sources, then after the employees. These are said to be some of the examples of entities. So, whenever we are designing and developing the databases for the organization, identifying and classifying objects into entity set can be difficult because objects can belong to the different sets, and if it is so, then it can be a complex job for us to differentiate these entity sets along to their categories. For example, a given person can be an entity which belong to two different entity sets. Either a person can be a student or a person can be an employee. Means if you are trying to distinguish between the student, a given student can be an entity. In the same way, a given student can be an employee as well. And that's why for the person, a person can be a student or the person can be an employee as well. So these are certain problems or the complexities while categorizing the entities along with their entity sets. Again, we can say that each entity is represented by a set of properties called as its attributes. Now, the properties that characterizes an entity set are called as basically its attributes. Again, attributes are also known as the data items, data elements, data fields, or the object property. Then after we can say that entity set and its attributes creates a model, and to store the data on an entity set we have to create a model for it. Means whenever we are trying to store the data relative to the entity set, we should have to identify each and every attributes of those entities as well as of those entity sets. So the attributes are the characteristics or the properties which gives us the detailed information about an entity or about an entity set. Okay, now we can see the detailed description of this entity along with their attributes and along with their domain. Now, when we are trying to discuss about the attribute, we have said that attributes are the characteristics or the properties which gives us the detailed information about an entity. Now, each attribute of an entity set has a particular value, and the values which are assigned to the attributes are called as attribute values. Again, whenever we are trying to assign the values for the attributes of the entity set, every value that are going to be assigned to the attribute must belong to the particular domain as well. Now, question simply arises, what is the meaning of this domain? Now, in the simple term or language, we can say that the set of values that a given attribute can have or possesses are basically called as its domain. For example, if I am having a student entity, again, along with the attributes roll number, name, address, and phone number. So, while just defining the structure or the schema definition of the student entity, at that time, for each attribute, I am just giving its domain, means I am defining its data type. For example, as far as the roll number attribute of the student entity is concerned, again, maximum 5 digit number can be assigned as a roll number to the student. This can be a limitation on the values that can be imposed or inserted for the attribute roll number of the entity set. Okay, so if we exceed this limit, definitely there will be the generation of error. Means again, if we are just populating the values, those values can be in combination of 0 to 9 digit, but at most of 5 digit long. You can't exceed this limit. So these are the limitations, and such types of limitations that can be imposed on the values of the attributes are simply called as the domain. Okay, now we will just elaborate the entity along with its attributes in the pictorial format in the figure given here. Now I am having the entity employee. Okay, you can see in the rectangular box, I have mentioned the entity employee. Now you can see the variety of attributes in the middle line, that is the name, employee number, job, salary, hire date, department number. Now these are said to be the attributes of the entity employee. So this is the simple representation of the entity along with its attributes. Now, again, we'll just move further. So, earlier we have seen the attributes along with its variety of entities. Now, we will see the attribute values and domains in more detail. Again, an entity set employee will contain all the set of persons employed by the organization, and we maintain the details of these persons by recording the values for their attributes. For example, we just trying to record details about the person ASK who is employee of an organization like the figure given below. Now we are having the entity set EMP. Again, the attributes are emp.name, then after emp.employee number, emp.address, emp.job, emp.salary, emp.department number. Now, point to be noted over here is that we are trying to just maintain the values for the entity set employee, again to the attributes, but pertaining to the respective domain. Now, as far as the attribute name is concerned, I am just trying to populate the domain compatible value ASK. For the employee number, I have populated the value 10. For the address, I have populated the value 15 MG Road. For the attribute job, I have populated the value lecturer. For salary and department number, I have populated the values 12,000 and 1010 respectively. So this is the way through which we can just identify the entity set along with its attributes, and we are trying to populate the domain compatible values for the respective attributes of a given entity set. So these are the three things. First one, we have identified the entity. Then after, its attributes. Now the third one, that is, we should have to track the relationship among one or more entity. Now simply, a relationship means a mapping that can exist among one or more entity can be simply termed as relationship. Again, we can say that a relationship is an association among two or more entities. A relationship set is the set of relationships of the sum of the same type of the same value. Okay, now a relationship set is always used in the data modeling to represent the association between the variety of entity set or one or more entity set. Again, the association could have certain properties which are generally represented by the attributes of the relationship set. And point to be noted again here is that whatever the kind of relationships that can exist among one or more entity, all these relationships has to be named in the proper manner. So these are the three important things, that is the identification of entity along with its attributes, and we should have to track the relationship. Now this just forms the foundation for designing and building or developing the database for any organization. Now you can see over here the relationship. We are having two entities. First one is the employee along with its attributes, and second one is the entity department again with along with its attributes. Now employee always works for the particular department. Now you can see in the figure that employee are or the entities are always represented with the help of rectangle. Again, the attributes of the entity are represented with the help of ovals or ellipse, and to just represent the relationship, we should have to use the diamond. Again, whatever the attributes along with the relationships of the entity, each one of these has to be connected with each other with the help of connecting line. So these are the some of the construct or the symbols that are used to represent the entity, relationship and attributes in entity relationship diagram. Now we'll just have a detailed example. I have just designed and developed the ER diagram for the hospital management system. Now, dear friends, if we just think about any hospital, then definitely for a given hospital, we are having a doctor. Again, we are having the patient. We are having the nurses, rooms and treatments. Means, if I am interested in designing the database for the hospital, then doctor, patient, nurse, rooms and treatments, these are the basic entities or basic entity sets. Okay, now for the doctor, again every doctor within a hospital has to be assigned with the unique employee number. Again, a doctor does have the name, he or she does have the address, again he or she does have certain specialization, again he or she may obtain certain salary. In the same way, for the nurse entity, we are having the attributes that are represented with the help of ovals. You can see employee number, name, salary, floor number and address. For the patient, I am again having the attributes like registration number, name, address, then after disease from which the given patient is suffering, and then after the blood group. For the room, I am having the attributes like room number, room type and the charges, and for the treatment entity, I am having the attributes like treatment code, treatment name and the charges. So these are the entities along with this their respective attributes. Now every doctor does have or has the patient. In the same way, the nurse will always work under a given doctor. Again, in the same manner, the nurse will look after to the patient. For taking the treatment, the patient has to be registered in the hospital, and whenever the patient is registered, he or she may be allotted to the room. At the same time, the patient will undergo one or more treatments simultaneously, and conversely we can say that each of the treatments in a hospital will be given by the doctors. So this is the simplest way of tracking the relationship of the attributes of the entity sets. Means if we are having the entity sets along with their attributes, then we can represent their relationship with the help of ER diagram like this that you can see on the figure here. Okay, so finally we'll conclude our discussion with the last topic, that is the records and file. In the simple way, a record is the collection of logically related fields or data items. Each field or processing a fixed number of bytes and having a fixed number of data types. Again, a record consists of the values for each field, and the record are retrieved or updated using certain kind of application programs. Means if we are just populating the values for the respective attributes of a given entity, then the collection of related values for each and every attributes will be termed as the records in the simple manner. Okay, now you can see over here. The next is the file. Again, a file is the collection of related sequence of records. Means whenever we are trying to store the record, it has to be kept in the well organized manner in a file. In most of the cases, all the records in the file are of the same type. That is, each record are having an identical format. Again, the file is said to be made of variable length of the records if every record in the file has exactly the same size in bytes. So these are some of the basic things as far as the file is concerned. In simple way, file is the collection of logically related records. Now you can see in the example, I am having the records along with their sequence, and these records can be kept or stored in the file. For example, John is the name for the person. Again, 7689 might be the employee number. Again, designation is manager. He is getting the salary 25,000, and 10 will be the department number. So the collection of the domain compatible values for each and every attribute of a given entity set will give us a record. In the same way, we are having the another example, that is Smith 7889 analyst 10,020. So these are certain things as far as the file is concerned. So dear friends, in today's session, we have seen some of the basic points as far as the data modeling of the database is concerned. Again, to conclude, if you are interested in designing and developing the database, you should have to first identify the object of interest, that are the entities. Again, you should have to identify their respective attributes. You should have to just track the relationship, and finally you should have to just impose certain constraints so that only the possible or the domain compatible values can be inserted for the respective attribute of a given entity. Once it has been done, you should have to draw or construct the logical diagram by using the entity relationship diagram for modeling all the object of interest to the organization. Thank you.